freedom. It's one of these ideas that everyone loves, that people are universally willing to die for, to sacrifice for. And it's different according to who you ask, right? Because there are some people that say, oh hey, we might live in a dictatorship, but it's our dictatorship, right? So there's no outside coercion going on. It's our thing going on, right? You got to think fascist Italians, right? There were a lot of people in that regime that were like, you know what? We might have a military dictatorship, but we are fundamentally free. It's ours. And then you have people on the other side of the spectrum who say that, people like the Swiss, right? We want to have a vote and the government actually does it, right? So we are only free if we can tell the government what to do and they actually do it. Very different conceptions of freedom. Now, one of the most compelling ideas of freedom comes from Friedrich von Hayek, who was an Austrian-born British economist. Hayek was alive during one of the worst times for freedom in history, right? There's the Soviet Union. There's the fascist governments of Italy and Germany. And even in the US and the UK, it looks like they were abandoning freedom too. So in this episode, we are going to be exploring the road to serfdom that he wrote in response to the dying freedom of his age. Hello there, my friends. Welcome back to History for Thinkers, a show that brings history to life. Before we get into it, I want to give a massive thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting the show. Guys, I'm glad history matters as much to you as it does me. I also want to personally thank Matthew and Tomas now for being financiers. If you guys want exclusive episodes once a month, or you want a shout out at the start of every episode, head on over to Patreon for more information. Now, let's get into the episode. So in this book, Friedrich von Hayek is going to argue that freedom is dying out. And not in places that you would expect like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, but places like the US and the UK. And he believes that it is all based on central planning, right? Government control of the economy. This is ultimately, he argues, going to lead to a totalitarian dictatorship, more or less. So he is very worried about that, and he's, this is kind of his way of screaming to the world, hey, totalitarian dictatorships are coming here, right? It's coming to the US, it's coming to the UK if we don't stop this nonsense that we're doing. Now, this was written during World War II, so some people have said that he was overly paranoid about it, right? Some government interference in the economy isn't the end of the world, right? So just understand that there are many criticisms of this work as well. But you can ultimately view Friedrich von Hayek as a classical liberal. So he wants to expand economic freedom and individual liberty as much as humanly possible, right? That is the most important thing, not just for the government, but for all of humanity. Right. We need to be able to make our own choices, to sink or swim on our own. And that is really the basis for this book. But we need to start with some definitions, because the book is called The Road to Serfdom. What the heck is serfdom? Right? So serfdom is a political, economic, and social system most prevalent during medieval Europe. So here are a couple things that describe it. Now, this is pretty much universally reviled by most people, during the 1900s and especially today, right? We look back on serfdom as kind of backward, regressive, right? It kind of sucks. And here are a couple of reasons, right? So there's this rigid hierarchical system. You are if you're above someone, you can tell them to do whatever the heck, and they kind of have to listen, right? So it's very rigid, very hierarchical. Every single relationship with every single person that is, I'm above them or I'm below them, and exactly, by how much, right? So there's no social mobility. So it doesn't matter how smart you are, how hard you work, what you do, you can be the best person in the world or the worst, right? You are in your social status and that's it. And that wouldn't be the end of the world, except, right, you inherit your status. So if you are this brilliant, smart person, you're a deep thinker, right, you're a great person. If you are born a serf, you are going to stay a serf, right? And that's very rough, and that very much sucks, right? So understandably, people were happy when this system collapsed. And generally, serfdom is organized around religion. So when you look at, a place like medieval Europe, it was around Christianity. But then there were also places like, in South America, there were certain places and they were organized around those religions, right? The ancient Incas and the Mayas. In Asia, a lot of it was organized around the folk religions, right? So generally there are three classes in any given serf society or feudal society, right? Whatever word you want to use. Basically the same thing. So there's the nobility, right? The kings, the queens, the people that basically control the whole show. Then there's the clergy, right? And this doesn't necessarily refer to the Christian clergy, but, the priests, right? The people that are, that control the culture, more or less. And then there's everyone else. And it's more or less, the 99% is serfs. So the nobility and the clergy, right? Again, they were just the 1%. And then there's everyone else. So the serfs were comparable to slaves, right? Even when you look at other feudal societies, like in South America, for example, part of the reason the Spanish conquistadors had such an easy time of conquering those civilizations was because, well, the underclasses were really pissed off. And they teamed up with the Spanish conquistadors, right? Like, funnily enough, there were a lot of, these people that were like, yeah, I'll help overthrow the system if it means I don't have to be a feudal serf anymore, right? And you have to imagine, probably the same dynamic would have played out if there were foreign invaders coming to Europe or any other given civilization for that matter. So it kind of ripe for plunder in that way. Now, at least in medieval Europe, you were not seen as explicitly property, but still you were more or less a slave. In practice, you had no control over your life. You had to work and serve an entire class of other people. And again, like I said, to an extent, this existed everywhere, right? From pre-European South America to Asia, all over the place, even in Africa. So this is, I kind of think of it as almost like a form of evolution, right? So governments evolve, right? We learn from other governments. Oh, if we do things this way, we'll get this result. And then people inevitably follow the better result, right? So I just kind of view it as an early iteration of a way to structure society, right? You compare the old iPhone, right? Like maybe the first or the second iPhone to the iPhone today, right? Very stark contrast there, right? The very early one kind of sucks. So, going back to serfdom is very much seen as like a backward evolution, right? Things are getting better. Why do you want to bring in central planning in the economy and go back to this, right? Why do you want to go back to serfdom? So that's ultimately the line of thought that von Hayek is taking here. So again, he is a big proponent of classical liberalism, right? Individual autonomy. He wants economic freedom. He wants people to be able to get rich, to start businesses, to do whatever the heck they want to do. And he also advocates largely for civil liberties, right? So everyone's equal before the law. Now, this philosophy, the philosophy of classical liberalism, largely developed in response to mercantilism. Now, let's understand what mercantilism actually is, right? So, mercantilism allowed for private ownership of business and economic activity as long as it helped the government, right? So, the good example is the British Empire, because they were very mercantilist. You were allowed to start a business. You were allowed to own private property. You were allowed to get rich as hell. But you had to do so in a way that was good for the government, that didn't undermine them. You weren't allowed to trade with enemies. So you compare the British Empire to the Spanish Empire, they stopped each other from trading, right? So there were a lot of business owners that could have maybe they were British and they could have sold a whole bunch of tea to the Spaniards, right? That would have been great for them, would have made a lot of money. But the British Empire was like, well, that's going to be good for the Spanish Empire. So we're not going to allow that. And that is, basically the history of these different colonial empires right there, right? A bunch of trade wars, So this modern stuff we see with the US and China and everyone else, this is not new. This has always been going on, right? You stop your business people from trading with them and it hurts them. So even in some ways, we're still mercantilistic now. That's a topic for another time, though. So these colonies, especially with the British Empire specifically, they were actually not started by the military, but by companies, right? So there was this private ownership, this let's go get rich idea behind the British Empire, particularly, and a lot of others, right? And one of the things that they did was forced specialization. So you think about the 13 colonies here in the US. Well, there were some that were more or less forced to, I think Georgia, they had to only grow cotton. So they were basically forced into specialization. Now that makes Georgia very weak in independence. So they can't grow their own food, right? Or they're discouraged from growing their own food. They are discouraged from doing a whole bunch of things that would make them more self-sufficient, more independent, but it helps the overall British economy. So you've got one colony that does nothing but do cotton. Okay, that's great. And then you've got another colony that does nothing but make tea. All right, so we got Pennsylvania over here. They do nothing but make tea. And that overall makes the economy better. But again, it limits your individual freedom. If you live in, this or that state, you're not allowed to start a business on whether or not you want to, maybe you're passionate about tea making, but you live in Georgia, right? You don't want to be a cotton guy, so sucks to suck, right? And again, this just hinders economic independence, but made the overall empire wealthier. So another thing that von Hayek is going to be arguing against here is socialism. Now, we need to understand what the heck socialism is. So he is arguing against state socialism. There are a whole bunch of different forms of socialism, right? I think state socialism is most accurately described as communism, right? We're going to have collective ownership of everything, and it's all going to be through the government, and theoretically, we all have a say in the government. If you guys are fans of history, you know how well this system plays out, right? Everyone's like, yeah, everything, we're just going to all be equal. We're all going to own everything equally, and we all have a say in this government. It's going to work out great. Doesn't play out that way, as history has shown time and time again. But it's important to understand that there are other branches of socialism that, they advocate for the social ownership of the means of production. So another version could be that the people who work the factory should be the owners, right? So more or less an economy of small business owners, right? And that's only one other version. There are lots of different kinds of socialism, but understand that von Hayek is attacking state socialism, right? Communism as we understand it today, not these other kinds. So with all that out of the way, I think we can finally start getting into the episode itself, some of the meat and potatoes. So the government had a lot of control in the 20th century, at least compared to previous generations. And it was expanding faster than ever before. This was partly due to the catastrophes going on. A lot of it was also from, the technology expanding, right? People from the government could now, mass communicate with everyone, right? We had the radios and then even TVs and stuff like that, right? It was pretty crazy tech. But of course, this was also the century of fascism and communism, which didn't play out so well. So communism nationalized industries, right? Basically just turned everything into government property and, oh yeah, the government's going to run everything great. But when you look at even fascist governments, it's not necessarily a centrally planned economy, at least in theory. But in practice, right, what happened was the big businesses in Germany and Italy collaborated with the regimes. So let's just understand that there is no consensus on what fascist economics actually is, right? Maybe self-sufficiency, but that's about it right there. And even then, who knows? There are all kinds of different fascist regimes across the world that have existed that to an extent did have free markets, that did have private property and ownership, and you could start a business, but they were still fascist governments, right? You didn't have a vote, right? If the government wanted to kill you and take your stuff, they could, and there was no recourse. But von Hayek warns of the, quote, danger of tyranny that inevitably results from government control of economic decision-making through central planning. So this is the big idea here. There is an inevitable tyranny that comes from this central planning, right? Whether that's communism, where they nationalize everything, or even with Germany and Italy, where they more or less partner up with big business, right? Where the big companies more or less entrenched in the government itself. And his big fear is that it was coming to us. It was coming to the US, it was coming to the UK, and then we're going to be dictatorships too. So he saw in practice these bastions of freedom abandoning freedom as well. Von Hayek noted Western nations, quote, progressively abandon that freedom in economic affairs without which personal and political freedom has never existed in the past. So we are really free right now. Don't mess this up. Don't go back to serfdom, because that's essentially what these other people are doing. And part of the reason that he had this fear was because the US and the UK had adopted some elements of central planning in the 1900s, right? Ideas that you could call socialism, right? Creeping socialism, right? Red Scare. One example was FDR's New Deal, right? So, you can have different opinions on that. A lot of people largely do view it as a positive. I actually live in Tennessee, and if it had not been for the New Deal, we would still be getting flooded to this day. So Tennesseans view the New Deal particularly positively, but again, there were elements of socialism. There were elements of, a lot of government spending and having more and more influence on the economy. Now, there was a common justification by FDR and people like him. And they justified it by saying that giving people a little bit of socialism was going to stop them from asking for a lot. So, people on the far left, right, socialists, communists, whatever, the reason that they are so angry and embittered is, they've got these legitimate grievances. So let's acknowledge some of them. Let's, give people some government benefits and whatnot, right? And that's kind of the way it went down. But Hayek believed that these were steps toward a centrally planned economy. And again, this inevitably leads to tyranny. Inevitably leads to, having your own Stalin or your own Hitler or whatever, right? An economy that more or less resembled feudal Europe, right? So you think about these statist religions, right? Communism and fascism, their economies were more or less stagnant, right? More or less. And it was extremely unequal, right? Especially in the communist regime, it was like Stalin was living like a king. Everyone else kind of lived like shit. So it was just kind of a rough system. And in many ways, it is just kind of a modern version of serfdom. So Hayek believed that central planning inevitably leads to totalitarianism because it requires, quote, the will of a small minority be imposed upon the people. And this is really the big idea behind his argument here. The will of a small minority being thrusted upon millions and millions of people. Right? That is the reason that feudal Europe sucked. That is the reason that the serfs were, more or less slaves and had to suffer all day and, be born into slavery. And, oh, your kids are slaves too. Like, it sucked. And what made it so bad is an idea that is present also in communism and fascism, right? The government says we're going to do things this way, and, well, that's how we're going to have to do them, right? And even if it didn't Even if it wasn't bad to begin with, like let's say you start out with good intentions, inevitably that small minority of people will go bad, right? Let's understand, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So even if you have like one or two good kings, right? Historically, you look at monarchy, right? There were some good kings. Like, that's a fact. But sooner or later, you get a bad one. You get a bad one, and it kind of cancels out any of the good that a good king could have done. Von Hayek also argued that this reduced individual liberty because, quote, the individual would more than ever become a mere means to be used by the authority in the service of such abstractions as the social welfare or the good of the community. So we more or less become cogs in a machine. We are reduced to something that the government can use as a tool, right? And when you look at the way that these governments treated their people, that is more or less how it played out. Joseph Stalin did not worry about the soldiers in the Red Army. They were tools. They were something that, you know what? We're going to throw as many people as we can at those Germans. And they're going to die, but you know, we've got more people than they've got bullets. And that's how he won the war. And in practice, that is exactly how it played out. Same with the fascist governments, right? Their people were expendable. They were a means to an end. And what happens is your life becomes expendable to the government. You are just a tool for them. Nothing more, nothing less. So he draws a stark comparison between democracy and socialism, and he writes, quote, democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word, equality. But notice the difference. While democracy seeks equality in liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude. So the socialist regimes, they want everyone equally miserable, right? You got to think, democratic governments, right, the US and the UK, we want equality before the law, not economic equality. We don't want everyone to be equal, but we want the government, the laws, the police system, the justice system to treat everyone the same. If you're rich, you're going to go to prison for killing a kid. If you're poor, you're going to go to prison for killing a kid. That's the way it should work. But you should be allowed to be poor or be rich based on your own merits, your relationship to the free market, right? Von Hayek does a really good job of expanding on this idea here, that the idea that central planning always leads to violence, that it's necessarily and inevitably going to happen. And he writes, quote, while the last resort of a competitive economy is the bailiff, the ultimate sanction of a planned economy is the hangman. So in our competitive free market, democratic governments, right, we have courts. We can settle our disagreements like settle civilized people. But in the socialist way of doing things, well, there's no room for disagreement. If you disagree with what Joseph Stalin is doing, he's going to kill you. That's it. There's no room for argument, right? And so it kind of gets at this idea that violence is the only way of resolving conflict, because every society is going to have some kind of conflict, right? People are going to disagree, people are going to hate each other, and they're going to fight if they don't have a court to settle their disputes. And if reality and history has shown us anything, it's that this was worse than von Hayek could have possibly known, because he's living through this. Not everyone knew about what was going on in the Soviet Union and whatnot, but you look at something like the Moscow show trials, it was a pretty rough time. If you disagreed with the government, or the government was even a little suspicious of you, they were going to get you. And they were going to make a public spectacle of you, and they were going to psychologically torture you and force you to commit to crimes that you couldn't even have committed, right? Some pretty crazy stuff. So it was worse than von Hayek even realized. But he also argued against this other idea, that fascism is not a capitalist response to socialism. So let's start from point A. So feudalism turned into mercantilism, which turned into capitalism. Now, capitalism had its flaws, right? Early on, right, workers' rights were really bad, child labor, people could make food and it could be basically poison. They could take a shit in the soup. And that was, like you couldn't do anything about it, right? So we had to improve upon that. And the socialists were some of the early people to point out a lot of the flaws in capitalism. And many Marxists, particularly, they believe that fascism is capitalism's natural response to socialism. This is a very prevalent idea among leftists and socialists even today. And it goes back through this time period. And there is a possibly false quote from Benito Mussolini. There's no proof that he actually wrote this, but I think because of its popularity and how much it does encapsulate a lot of his ideology, I think it is worth acknowledging. So this false quote goes like this, quote, "Fascism should more properly be called corporatism, since it is the merger of state and corporate power." And again, you look at what went down in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Big government, big business, they got in the cahoots. That is how it happened. And, again, Mussolini probably did not say this, right? It has not been verified historically, but I think it encapsulates the idea very well. So that is kind of why people, especially like the Marxists, right? Marxists, socialists, they believed that capitalism is just, it doesn't want to give in to the socialist demands. So what does it do? It goes to fascism, where the big governments partner with the big business and they're going to crush socialism, right? Which is also why, there were a lot of big industrialists that were buddy-buddy with the Nazi regime. So let's just acknowledge that some of that did come true. But let's also acknowledge von Hayek's point. And he would say something to the effect of, well, you look at the central planning in the Soviet Union, you look at the central planning more or less going on in these fascist governments, right? There's a lot more similarities between socialism or communism and fascism than there is between fascism and capitalism, right? So that's more or less his rebuttal on the whole thing. But let's also have a little disclaimer at the end here, because von Hayek, you can interpret some of these ideas in a certain way. You can, call him a radical free market individualist or whatever else, but he does not think that any government involvement is bad. In fact, that there's this common perception today that socialism is when the government does stuff, right? And honestly, guys, I lean right myself, right? I'm fairly conservative in a lot of my views. But, the idea that socialism is when the government does anything is kind of flawed, right? The government has to do some stuff. And he acknowledged that the government needs to have some authority over the economy, right? It needs to protect people from fraud and scams. And, again, you think about some of the early stuff that went on with capitalism in its early days, right? People would make food, they would use rotten meat, and people would get sick, right? If it were not for government laws coming around and changing that, there was, maybe today we would still be eating food and sometimes it makes us sick and die because, they didn't use clean cooking utensils or whatever. So von Hayek articulated this idea like this, quote, "In no system that could be rationally defended would the state just do nothing." So the government does have to do some stuff, right? And it's not socialism when it happens, right? It's not socialism if the government does something. And again, it still needs to protect against fraud and bad actors and monopolies. And, right, there are ways that your freedom can be limited by corporations, right? And, the free market is not the be-all, end-all God of everything, right? It does have some limitations in what it can and cannot do. And von Hayek even believed for a strong safety net, writing, quote, "There is no reason why, in a society which has reached the general level of wealth ours has, the first kind of security should not be guaranteed to all without endangering general freedom, that is, some minimum of food, shelter, and clothing sufficient to preserve health." And you can view this as, maybe social welfare, maybe some version of universal basic income. You can interpret this whatever way you want, but he more or less argues that there needs to be a strong safety net. for people. We don't just let people die because, they're hungry, right? We got to feed people, and again, that is a movement that is not so fond of people that like von Hayek. So again, let's acknowledge he does have some ideas here that are typically thought of as left-wing or anti-free market or socialist or whatever. But he does have these disclaimers. He's a very nuanced guy. All great thinkers are very nuanced, right? They don't just worship this or that idea. Right? The free market is not the be-all, end-all. But my friend, that is going to be it for the episode. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. Make sure to check out the Patreon page if you guys want more content or maybe to get a shout out at the start of every episode. Really appreciate you guys so much. This has been Michael from History for Thinkers. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.
Thank you.